"Ma'am, you're not supposed to be here," the officer said, and the words landed in the courthouse hallway like a gavel striking too early. The corridor outside Courtroom 4B smelled faintly of floor polish and old paper, the kind of quiet government building scent that never quite leaves your clothes. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, while attorneys hurried past with leather briefcases and thick binders of motions. It was just past 8:20 a.m., 20 minutes before the morning docket, and the courthouse in downtown Atlanta was waking up the way it always did, slow, orderly, and slightly tense. In the middle of that routine stood a woman in a charcoal gray suit, calm and steady, holding a stack of case files against her chest. Her name was Naomi Brooks. At that moment, however, the two police officers blocking her path didn't know that. Officer Daniel Mercer glanced down at the badge clipped to his uniform, and then back at Naomi with the kind of skeptical stare reserved for people who looked like they wandered into the wrong place. Beside him, Officer Kyle Bennett leaned casually against the wall, arms folded, watching the scene with mild curiosity. "Court staff entrance is around the back," Mercer added, gesturing down the hallway as if directing someone toward a service door. Naomi didn't move. She simply looked at the officer for a moment, her expression composed, her posture straight, the stack of legal folders balanced neatly in her hands. The hallway traffic slowed slightly. A junior attorney passing by paused just long enough to sense the tension before continuing toward the courtroom doors. Naomi spoke quietly, her voice measured and even. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Mercer gave a small laugh, the kind that carries just enough disbelief to make nearby people glance over. "Ma'am, we're trying to keep things moving this morning. Big docket. Lots of people. Let's not make this complicated." Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, adjusting the files in her arms as a few loose pages slipped from the top. One sheet fluttered toward the marble floor, skimming across the polished surface before stopping near Mercer's boot. He didn't pick it up. Bennett smirked slightly, shifting his weight against the wall as if the entire situation were mildly entertaining. Naomi bent down, retrieving the paper carefully, smoothing the edge before placing it back into the stack. The quiet patience in that small movement seemed to stretch the moment longer than anyone expected. Down the hallway, the court clerk Evelyn Ross stepped out of a side office carrying a clipboard. She froze mid-step the instant she recognized Naomi. Her eyes widened, though she said nothing yet. Mercer, unaware of the change in the room's atmosphere, continued speaking in the confident tone of someone certain he understood the situation. "Look, we've got rules here," he said, gesturing again toward the public entrance. "If you're here for a hearing, the gallery doors open in a few minutes." Naomi straightened fully, meeting his gaze without raising her voice or showing even the slightest hint of frustration. The courthouse air felt strangely still, as if the building itself had paused to listen. She adjusted the sleeve of her jacket, gathered the files neatly against her arm, and took a single step forward toward the courtroom doors. Mercer instinctively shifted to block the path again. For a moment no one spoke. The hum of the overhead lights filled the silence. Evelyn Ross's clipboard slipped slightly in her hands. Bennett glanced between the two officers and the woman in the gray suit, sensing something he couldn't quite name. Naomi's voice finally broke the quiet, calm and certain. "Officer," she said softly, "you might want to step aside." Neither officer moved. They didn't know yet that in less than a minute, the entire hallway would be standing. They didn't know that the woman they were stopping was about to walk into that courtroom, climb the steps behind the bench, and take the seat that controlled every word spoken inside those walls. And they definitely didn't know that the moment unfolding in that quiet hallway would soon become the only thing anyone in the courthouse talked about all day. The hallway outside Courtroom 4B did not return to normal after Naomi Brooks spoke those quiet words. Something subtle had shifted in the air, the kind of change people feel before they understand it. Officer Daniel Mercer remained planted in front of the courtroom doors, shoulders squared with the easy confidence of someone who had spent years controlling crowded spaces. To him, this was still a simple situation. A courthouse visitor standing in the wrong place. A quick redirection. Nothing more. Officer Kyle Bennett watched from the wall, still leaning casually with his arms folded, but his expression had begun to tighten slightly. It was not fear. It was uncertainty, the faint sense that a detail had been overlooked. Naomi Brooks stood with complete composure, the stack of case files balanced carefully against her forearm. The papers were neatly tabbed with colored markers, the kind lawyers and judges use when a morning calendar is full. A few attorneys walking past slowed just enough to observe the exchange. One of them, a middle-aged defense lawyer carrying a worn leather briefcase, paused briefly near the water fountain. He did not interrupt, but he watched. Down the hallway, Evelyn Ross still had not moved. The court clerk had worked in the Fulton County Courthouse for nearly 12 years. She knew the rhythm of the building the way a conductor knows an orchestra. She knew which judges arrived early, which attorneys rushed at the last minute, and which officers liked to keep the hallway clear before a major hearing. And she also knew exactly who Naomi Brooks was. Evelyn opened her mouth as if to speak, then stopped. Something about the moment told her to wait. Mercer, however, remained focused on Naomi with the patient firmness of someone used to repeating instructions. He gestured again toward the public corridor behind them. "Ma'am, the public gallery will open shortly. Until then, we need to keep this hallway clear." Naomi did not argue. She simply looked at the officer, calm eyes steady, the slightest trace of curiosity in her expression. "Officer Mercer," she said quietly. The name landed softly but with unmistakable precision. Mercer blinked once. Very few courthouse visitors addressed officers by name unless they had read the badge closely. Bennett straightened slightly from the wall. Naomi continued in the same, even tone. "You have a responsibility to keep the courthouse orderly. I respect that." Her voice carried no sarcasm, no irritation, just calm acknowledgement. A few feet away, the defense attorney by the fountain slowly turned his head, listening more carefully now. Naomi shifted the files in her arms and glanced briefly toward the courtroom doors behind Mercer. The brass plaque mounted beside the entrance read Courtroom 4B in polished lettering that reflected the overhead lights. Inside, the room remained empty for the moment, waiting for the morning session to begin. Naomi returned her attention to Mercer. "But there is also a responsibility," she said gently, "to know who is supposed to walk through those doors." Mercer frowned slightly. Something in her tone suggested authority, yet her calm posture gave away nothing. Bennett finally pushed himself off the wall, stepping a little closer as if trying to understand the shift in the conversation. The hallway noise had faded almost completely now. Attorneys who had been passing through moments earlier had slowed their pace. Evelyn Ross finally began walking toward them, her heels clicking against the marble floor in quick, nervous steps. Naomi noticed her approach but did not turn. Instead, she looked back at Mercer and spoke one more quiet sentence that carried across the corridor with surprising weight. "You may want to reconsider where you are standing." Mercer followed her gaze for the first time, glancing toward the courtroom doors behind him. At that exact moment, Evelyn Ross reached the group, her voice breaking into the silence with a breathless urgency. "Officer Mercer," she said quickly, her eyes wide. "Step aside. Right now." Mercer looked confused. Bennett looked from Evelyn to Naomi, then back again. The courthouse hallway held its breath as the truth of the situation began to rise slowly to the surface, like a courtroom verdict no one had expected to hear. Officer Daniel Mercer stared at Evelyn Ross as if she had just spoken a language he did not understand. For a moment he did not move. The courthouse hallway remained frozen in that fragile silence where every person present sensed something important had shifted, but no one yet understood the full shape of it. Evelyn stepped closer, her clipboard pressed tightly against her chest. "Officer Mercer," she repeated more firmly, "you need to step aside." Mercer glanced briefly at Bennett, then back at the court clerk. "What is going on?" he asked, his voice no longer confident, but edged with confusion. Bennett straightened completely now, the casual posture gone from his shoulders. Naomi Brooks remained exactly where she was, still holding the organized stack of files, her expression composed, patient, and almost reflective. She did not rush the moment. She simply waited. Evelyn finally turned toward Naomi, and the tension in her face softened immediately. "Good morning, Your Honor," she said with a respectful nod that echoed through the hallway louder than any raised voice could have. The words struck the corridor like a sudden bell. The defense attorney near the water fountain slowly lowered his cup. Two younger attorneys further down the hall exchanged startled glances. Officer Bennett blinked twice, as if trying to process what he had just heard. Mercer looked from Evelyn to Naomi, then back again, the realization creeping across his face one piece at a time. Naomi Brooks inclined her head slightly toward Evelyn in acknowledgement. "Good morning, Ms. Ross," she replied in the same calm voice she had used from the beginning. Mercer took a half-step backward without realizing he had moved. The courtroom doors behind him suddenly felt far heavier than they had a minute earlier. Bennett cleared his throat quietly, his eyes dropping to the floor as if the polished marble had become very interesting. Evelyn turned to Mercer again, her voice measured but unmistakably firm. "Judge Brooks is presiding over the morning docket in Courtroom 4B, she explained. "The session begins in 10 minutes. Mercer swallowed, his mind clearly racing through the last several minutes in reverse. The questions he had asked, the assumptions he had made, the way he had stood between her and the courtroom doors with the certainty that he was in control of the situation. Naomi watched him with the same calm patience she had shown from the start. There was no anger in her expression, no visible frustration. Only the quiet steadiness of someone who understood exactly where authority truly lived inside a courthouse. A few more people had gathered at the edges of the hallway now, drawn by the tension that had built around the courtroom entrance. No one spoke. Naomi adjusted the files in her arms once more and looked toward the brass plaque beside the door. Courtroom 4B reflected the overhead lights like a mirror. Then she turned back to Mercer. "Officer," she said gently, her tone still even and respectful, "shall we begin the day properly?" Mercer immediately stepped aside, clearing the doorway with a stiff movement that revealed just how quickly the balance of the moment had shifted. Bennett followed his lead, moving back against the wall again, but this time standing straight. Naomi Brooks walked forward with quiet confidence, her heels tapping softly against the marble floor as she reached the courtroom doors. Evelyn moved ahead to open them. Inside, the empty courtroom waited, the judge's bench rising above the rows of wooden seats like the center of gravity in the room. Naomi stepped through the doorway without hesitation. Behind her, the hallway remained silent. Every person present now fully aware that the calm woman they had just watched walk inside was the one who would soon bring the entire courtroom to its feet. The courtroom door closed softly behind Naomi Brooks, and the sound seemed to settle into the wood-paneled room like a quiet declaration that the morning had officially begun. The space inside Courtroom 4B carried the calm weight of law and routine. Rows of polished wooden benches stretched across the room beneath tall windows where the early Georgia sunlight filtered through thin blinds. The American flag stood near the judge's bench, its colors steady in the still air, while the seal of the state hung high on the wall above the elevated chair that controlled every proceeding inside those walls. Naomi walked forward at an unhurried pace, the measured rhythm of her footsteps echoing lightly across the floor. She placed the organized stack of files on the wide wooden desk behind the bench and carefully opened the top folder. Colored tabs marked each case scheduled for the morning docket. Every page had been reviewed hours earlier, long before the courthouse doors opened to the public. Naomi glanced once across the empty gallery seats, then toward the counsel tables where attorneys would soon stand to argue their motions. Outside the courtroom, voices began to stir again as people gathered for the session. Inside, the room remained still. Evelyn Ross stepped through the door moments later carrying the court calendar and a digital tablet used for recording the session. She approached the bench with the quiet efficiency of someone who had worked beside judges long enough to anticipate every detail before it was spoken. "The docket is full this morning, Your Honor," she said softly. Naomi nodded as she reviewed the first file. "Thank you, Ms. Ross." Her voice carried the calm authority that filled the room even when it was nearly empty. Meanwhile, outside in the hallway, Officer Daniel Mercer remained standing near the courtroom doors. The earlier confidence in his posture had completely vanished. He rubbed his hands together slowly, replaying the last several minutes again and again in his mind. Officer Bennett stood beside him in silence, no longer leaning against the wall. Both men could hear the faint movement inside the courtroom as preparations continued. Bennett finally spoke in a quiet voice. "You did not know." Mercer did not answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the brass plaque mounted beside the door. Courtroom 4B reflected the overhead lights, just as it had earlier, but now the polished metal seemed heavier somehow. "I should have known," Mercer said at last, his voice low. Bennett glanced down the hallway where attorneys and courthouse staff were beginning to line up outside the room. None of them spoke about what had happened, but the looks they exchanged carried enough meaning on their own. Back inside the courtroom, Naomi Brooks reached for the black robe hanging neatly behind the bench. The fabric was smooth and carefully pressed, the symbol of a responsibility larger than any single moment in a hallway. She slipped the robe over her shoulders and adjusted the sleeves with practiced ease. Then she sat down in the high-backed chair behind the bench. From that position, the entire courtroom came into view. The witness stand to her right, the clerk's desk below, the rows of seats where citizens would soon watch the process of justice unfold. Naomi placed both hands lightly on the desk as Evelyn Ross moved toward the front of the room. The courtroom doors opened again and attorneys began to enter, their voices lowering automatically out of respect for the setting. Conversations faded to whispers. Papers rustled quietly. Outside, Mercer and Bennett stepped away from the doorway, clearing the path as people filed inside. No one needed to explain the shift that had taken place that morning. The room itself seemed to understand it. Evelyn Ross stood near the center of the courtroom and looked toward the bench. Naomi Brooks gave a small nod. The clerk turned toward the gallery and spoke clearly so every person in the room could hear. All rise. The benches creaked softly as everyone stood at once. The courtroom, filled only moments earlier with ordinary conversation, became silent with respect. And at the center of that silence sat the woman who had walked through the hallway minutes before with nothing more than a stack of files and the calm certainty that truth eventually reveals itself. The sound of people rising filled the courtroom like a quiet wave moving through rows of polished wood. Every person in the room stood facing the bench as Judge Naomi Brooks looked calmly across the gallery. The early sunlight through the tall windows cast long stripes across the floor, touching the edges of the counsel tables where attorneys now waited with folders open and pens ready. Naomi allowed the silence to settle for a moment before speaking. Please be seated. Chairs shifted as the room returned to order. The calm rhythm of the courtroom began to take shape, the familiar routine that turns individual voices into the structured language of law. Evelyn Ross sat at the clerk's desk with her tablet ready, fingers poised to record the proceedings. Naomi glanced down at the first case file, and then back up at the attorneys standing before her. We will begin with docket item 1, she said in a steady voice. A defense attorney stepped forward and introduced himself for the record. The prosecutor followed. The exchange was calm, professional, and measured. For several minutes the courtroom moved exactly as it was supposed to move. Legal arguments were presented. Dates were confirmed. Motions were scheduled. Naomi listened carefully, occasionally asking a short question that cut directly to the point that mattered. Her tone never rose. Her words were precise and clear. To the people watching from the gallery, it looked like any other morning in court. Yet just beyond the closed doors, Officer Daniel Mercer remained in the hallway with the weight of the earlier encounter pressing quietly on his shoulders. Through the heavy wood doors he could hear the faint cadence of Naomi's voice as she managed the docket. Each sentence reminded him who now sat on the other side of that wall. Officer Bennett stood nearby, watching attorneys enter and exit between hearings. After several minutes, he spoke quietly. You should talk to her. Mercer shook his head slowly. Not while court is in session. Bennett did not argue. Inside the courtroom, Naomi concluded the first case and moved to the next file. The routine continued with calm efficiency. Attorneys approached the podium, presented their arguments, and stepped back again. Every movement in the room followed the invisible order that courts rely upon to function. Yet Naomi's mind had not completely left the hallway from earlier that morning. She remembered the confusion in Mercer's voice, the uncertainty in the room when Evelyn had spoken her title aloud. Moments like that were not new to her. They had followed her throughout years of studying law, years of standing in courtrooms where some people saw her position immediately and others needed time to understand it. Naomi did not carry anger about those moments. What she carried instead was patience and responsibility. Responsibility to the law. Responsibility to the courtroom. Responsibility to the people who entered that room expecting fairness above everything else. She closed the second file and looked toward Evelyn Ross. Next matter. The clerk read the case name clearly for the record. As the attorneys stepped forward again, Naomi glanced briefly toward the courtroom doors. They remained closed. the hallway beyond hidden from view. Somewhere on the other side of that door stood two officers who had begun their morning believing they controlled the hallway. Now they stood outside the room where the authority of the law rested in one chair. Naomi returned her attention to the case in front of her and continued the session without pause. The courtroom listened carefully, unaware that before the morning was over, the quiet lesson that began in that hallway would return to this room in a way no one there would forget. The courtroom continued to move with the steady rhythm of a place built on rules and patience. By mid-morning, the gallery had filled with observers, attorneys waiting for later hearings, and a few members of the public who had wandered in to watch the proceedings. Sunlight shifted across the tall windows as the clock on the wall moved closer to 10:30. Judge Naomi Brooks remained composed behind the bench, reviewing the next file with careful attention, while Evelyn Ross recorded every word spoken in the room. One case concluded and another began, each matter handled with the same calm focus. A property dispute, a procedural motion, a short scheduling hearing. To an outsider it might have seemed ordinary, but every detail mattered inside a courtroom. Naomi understood that better than most. Across the room, attorneys listened closely, adjusting their notes each time the judge asked a question that cut directly to the heart of a legal argument. Her tone never changed. It remained even, measured, and precise. The voice of someone who had learned that authority in a courtroom did not come from volume, but from clarity. Outside the courtroom doors, the hallway remained busy, but Officer Daniel Mercer had not left his position near the entrance. He watched as attorneys stepped out, between hearings, and quietly discussed their cases before returning inside. Every time the door opened, he could hear Naomi Brooks speaking from the bench. Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone completely at ease in the role she held. Officer Kyle Bennett leaned against a nearby pillar, arms folded, observing Mercer with quiet concern. "You are still thinking about it," Bennett said after a long silence. Mercer nodded slowly without looking away from the door. "I should not have assumed," he said quietly. The words were not spoken with anger, only with the heavy realization that comes when a moment cannot be undone. Bennett glanced toward the door again. "Then when court breaks, you say something." Mercer exhaled slowly. He knew the advice was right. Yet inside the courtroom, Naomi Brooks had already turned to the next matter on the docket. The attorneys before her finished presenting their argument and stepped back from the podium. Naomi reviewed the notes in the file and spoke clearly so the entire courtroom could hear. "The motion will be scheduled for review next week. The clerk will confirm the date with both parties." Pens moved quickly as the attorneys wrote down the instruction. The courtroom remained quiet and attentive. Naomi closed the file and allowed a brief pause before the next case was called. In that small moment of silence, she once again glanced toward the courtroom doors. She knew the officers were still out there. She could sense it the same way experienced judges often sense tension in a room before anyone else notices it. Naomi did not carry resentment toward them. What she carried instead was the understanding that moments like the one in the hallway often reveal more about a system than about the individuals standing inside it. The law was not simply words written in books. It was the behavior people chose when they believed no one important was watching. Evelyn Ross looked up from the clerk's desk, noticing Naomi's brief glance toward the doors. Their eyes met for a moment. The clerk gave a small nod, acknowledging what both of them understood without saying it aloud. Naomi turned back to the bench and opened the next folder in the stack. "Next matter on the docket," she said calmly. The attorneys stepped forward again. Outside the courtroom, Mercer straightened his posture slightly as the door opened once more. He knew that soon the session would pause for a short recess. And when that moment arrived, the quiet conversation he needed to have would finally happen under the same roof, where the law demanded accountability from everyone who entered. The courtroom clock moved quietly toward 11:15 as the final case, before the mid-morning break, came to a close. The attorneys gathered their folders, murmured brief acknowledgments to one another, and stepped back from the podium. Judge Naomi Brooks reviewed the last note on the page in front of her, and then looked up across the room with the same calm focus she had carried all morning. The gallery had grown warm with the presence of people who had come and gone throughout the session. Sunlight had shifted farther across the polished floor, touching the edge of the witness stand and the first row of benches. Naomi closed the file gently and placed it on the stack beside her. "The court will take a 15-minute recess. she said clearly. Evelyn Ross recorded the instruction on her tablet while the room slowly began to stir again. Chairs moved softly as observers stood and stretched their legs. Attorneys stepped into the aisle to speak quietly with their clients. The structured silence of the courtroom relaxed just enough to allow ordinary conversation to return. Naomi stood from the bench and stepped through the small door that led to the judge's private chambers behind the courtroom. The robe moved lightly around her shoulders as she walked, the fabric carrying the quiet authority of the role she had held for years. Inside the chambers, the atmosphere was calm and orderly. A small wooden desk held neatly stacked files, and a narrow window overlooked the streets of downtown Atlanta, where late-morning traffic moved steadily between tall office buildings. Naomi removed the robe and placed it carefully on a hanger beside the door. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe in the quiet space, the steady rhythm of the morning session still echoing faintly in her thoughts. A soft knock sounded on the chamber door. "Come in," Naomi said. Evelyn Ross stepped inside holding the next group of files scheduled for the afternoon session. "The hallway is full again," Evelyn said gently. "Everyone is waiting for the second docket." Naomi nodded and accepted the folders. "Thank you, Ms. Ross." Evelyn hesitated for a brief moment before speaking again. "There is something else," she added carefully. Naomi looked up. Evelyn continued. "Officer Mercer asked if he could speak with you during the recess." Naomi did not respond immediately. She set the files neatly on the desk and folded her hands together, considering the request without any visible change in expression. Outside the chambers, the courthouse hallway had become active again as people moved between offices and courtrooms. Among them stood Officer Daniel Mercer, near the same doorway he had guarded earlier that morning. The confidence that once shaped his posture had been replaced by something quieter, something heavier. He watched the courtroom doors, waiting. Officer Bennett stood several feet away, giving him space, but remaining close enough to offer silent support. Mercer adjusted the collar of his uniform and took a slow breath. This was not the kind of conversation an officer ever planned for at the start of a shift, but it was the one he knew needed to happen. Inside the chambers, Naomi Brooks walked toward the door that led back into the courtroom corridor. Evelyn stepped aside as Naomi reached for the handle. The judge paused for a moment before opening it, her calm expression unchanged. Outside, the hallway voices softened when people noticed the door moving. Mercer straightened immediately as Naomi Brooks stepped into the corridor once again. For a brief second, the same hallway where the morning had begun fell completely quiet, as if the building itself remembered what had already taken place there. The courthouse hallway held a quiet tension the moment Judge Naomi Brooks stepped out from the chamber doorway. Conversations faded almost instantly as people recognized her presence. Attorneys standing near the benches lowered their voices. A few members of the public paused mid-step as if the air itself had changed. Naomi walked forward with the same steady composure she carried inside the courtroom, her posture relaxed but purposeful. The hallway lights reflected softly against the polished marble floor beneath her feet. Officer Daniel Mercer stood near the wall, where he had waited through the entire recess. When Naomi approached, he straightened immediately, removing his cap in a gesture of respect that came almost instinctively now. Officer Kyle Bennett remained several feet behind him, quietly stepping aside to give them space. Naomi stopped a short distance in front of Mercer and regarded him calmly. Her expression held neither anger nor impatience, only the attentive stillness of someone prepared to listen. Mercer cleared his throat, the words he had rehearsed in his mind suddenly feeling heavier now that the moment had arrived. "Your Honor," he began, his voice careful and respectful. "I asked to speak with you because I owe you an apology." Naomi did not interrupt. She simply waited. Mercer continued slowly. "This morning in the hallway, I made an assumption about who you were and where you belonged in this building. I spoke to you in a way that did not reflect the respect your position deserves. And that is something I regret." The hallway remained completely silent as he spoke. Several attorneys nearby pretended to review papers, but were clearly listening. Naomi studied Mercer for a moment, measuring the sincerity in his words. When she finally responded, her voice was calm and even. "Officer Mercer," she said, "a courthouse is a place where every person should be seen first as part of the system of law. Titles and positions matter here, but respect should not depend on them." Mercer nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of her words. Naomi continued gently. What happened this morning is not unusual. Many people enter buildings like this with expectations about who belongs in certain spaces. Sometimes those expectations are wrong. She paused briefly, letting the thought settle in the quiet hallway. Mercer looked down for a moment before raising his eyes again. I understand that now, he said. Naomi regarded him with steady calm. Understanding is where change begins, she replied. Officer Bennett watched from a distance, his expression thoughtful as the exchange unfolded. Around them the courthouse staff moved quietly, careful not to interrupt the conversation taking place in the corridor. Naomi adjusted the folder she carried and glanced briefly toward the courtroom doors where the second half of the docket would soon resume. Then she looked back at Mercer. Your responsibility in this building is important, she said. Security officers help maintain order so the law can function. But authority carries its own responsibility. It requires awareness. Mercer nodded again, more firmly this time. Yes, Your Honor. Naomi offered a small, respectful nod in return. There was no lecture in her tone, no attempt to humiliate him for the earlier moment. Instead, there was only the quiet certainty of someone who understood that the strongest lessons often arrive without anger. After a brief pause, she turned toward the courtroom doors. The recess is nearly over, she said calmly. Let us continue the work of the court. As Naomi Brooks walked back toward the courtroom entrance, the hallway remained silent for several seconds. Mercer replaced his cap slowly and stepped back to his post beside the door. The moment had passed, but the meaning behind it lingered in the corridor like a reminder that inside a courthouse, respect is not granted by assumption, but by the principles the law asks everyone to uphold. Judge Naomi Brooks returned to the courtroom with the same calm presence that had defined the entire morning. The hallway behind her slowly came back to life as conversations resumed in quiet tones, but inside Courtroom 4B the familiar order of the law quickly settled back into place. Attorneys found their seats again, papers arranged neatly on the counsel tables. Members of the public returned to the gallery benches, the wood creaking softly as people sat down. At the front of the room, Evelyn Ross stood beside the clerk's desk and waited for the judge to take her seat behind the bench. Naomi walked up the small set of steps and settled into the chair that overlooked the entire room. The black robe rested smoothly across her shoulders once more, its presence a reminder that the authority of the court belonged not to the person wearing it, but to the principles it represented. Naomi placed her hands lightly on the desk and looked across the room. The same attorneys who had argued earlier now waited respectfully for the afternoon session to begin. The air in the courtroom felt steady again, balanced and calm. Evelyn glanced toward the bench and spoke clearly. All rise. The room stood once more. Naomi inclined her head slightly before speaking. Please be seated. The second half of the docket began exactly as the first had. Case by case, attorneys stepped forward to present their matters. Naomi listened carefully, occasionally asking a brief question that guided the conversation back toward the legal issues that mattered most. Her voice remained steady and thoughtful, the kind of tone that reminded everyone in the room that a courtroom is not a stage for personalities, but a place for careful judgment. Outside the courtroom doors, Officer Daniel Mercer had returned to his post. His stance was straighter now, his attention sharper. When people approached the entrance, he greeted them politely and directed them inside with a quiet professionalism that had gained a new layer of awareness. Officer Kyle Bennett stood nearby, occasionally glancing toward the courtroom door as if reflecting on the morning's events. Neither officer spoke about what had happened earlier, yet the understanding between them had changed something important. Inside the courtroom, the final case of the afternoon concluded with a brief ruling. Naomi reviewed the documents one last time and closed the file. The court will adjourn for today, she said. Evelyn recorded the decision while the attorneys began gathering their materials. The gallery slowly emptied as people filed toward the doors. The routine of the courthouse continued as it always had, steady and methodical. Naomi stood from the bench and removed the robe once more before stepping through the door that led back to her chambers. For a moment, she paused near the window, overlooking the city streets below. Traffic moved in long lines through the afternoon sunlight, while pedestrians crossed intersections with the steady rhythm of daily life. Somewhere beyond those streets were countless other buildings where people carried assumptions about one another without realizing it. Naomi did not dwell on the morning's encounter. Instead, she thought about the quiet conversation that had followed. Respect, she knew, was not something enforced by authority alone. It was something learned in moments when people were willing to see beyond what they expected. Later that afternoon, as the courthouse slowly emptied, Officer Mercer walked past the now silent courtroom and paused briefly near the bench inside the empty room. The sunlight from the tall windows reached across the floor and touched the chair where Naomi Brooks had presided over the day's proceedings. Mercer looked at that chair for a moment before turning back toward the hallway. The building remained quiet now, but the lesson carried from that morning would remain long after the doors closed. And in the stillness of Courtroom 4B, the place where every voice had been heard and every person had been expected to stand with respect, the meaning of that lesson felt as solid as the walls that held the law.